Your soulmate is coming with a hidden secret. Archangel Michael says open this first, and the reason this message feels so powerful right now is because something has been quietly unfolding in your soulmate's heart for much longer than anyone around them realizes. From the outside, their life may appear completely ordinary, structured around routine, responsibilities, and the daily rhythm that most people experience without questioning too deeply. They wake up, move through their day, interact with people, and carry out the commitments that shape their life. To anyone observing them, there would be nothing unusual or dramatic about what they are experiencing. Yet inside their thoughts, something has been slowly building for a long time. There is a truth they have been carrying silently, a feeling they once believed would fade if they simply allowed enough time to pass. At first, they tried to treat this truth like a temporary thought. Something that appears in a person's mind occasionally but eventually disappears as life moves forward. People often do this with emotions that feel complicated or uncertain. When they are unsure how those emotions might affect the people around them, they choose silence as a form of protection. Silence can feel safe because it avoids conflict, avoids difficult explanations, and allows life to continue exactly as it has been. Your soulmate believed that if they remained patient and focused on their daily responsibilities, the secret inside them would eventually lose its intensity. But the human heart does not always follow the simple logic people expect. Instead of fading, the truth they carried began returning to their thoughts in quiet moments. Sometimes it happened late at night when everything around them became still and there were no distractions to occupy their attention. During those quiet hours, thoughts often become clearer because the mind finally has space to reflect. Other times it appeared during completely ordinary parts of the day, when something small reminded them of a conversation, a memory, or a feeling they once experienced. Each time the thought returned, they tried to push it aside again, telling themselves that revealing it might create more questions than answers. They worried that speaking openly about what they felt could change the way someone important to them looked at the situation. These concerns made them believe that keeping the secret hidden was the responsible choice. Yet every time they chose silence, the truth inside them seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker. It became clear that what they were feeling was not something temporary that would simply disappear with time. Instead, it was something that had quietly become part of their emotional reality. At this stage, the situation began shifting in a way they did not expect. The thoughts they once tried to avoid slowly turned into moments of reflection. Instead of immediately pushing the feeling away, they started asking themselves why it had remained present for so long. What was it about this truth that refused to fade even after so many months or years had passed? Why did it still feel meaningful enough to return during quiet moments of their day? As they began exploring these questions, they discovered that the secret they had been carrying was connected to a deeper understanding of themselves and their emotions. It was not simply about one specific memory or one specific situation. Instead, it was about the realization that certain connections in life leave a lasting impression that cannot easily be ignored. When two people share a moment of genuine understanding, that experience can remain meaningful long after circumstances change. Your soulmate had begun realizing that the truth they were hiding was connected to one of those moments. The connection they once experienced carried a depth they had never fully acknowledged before. At the time it happened, they may have treated it as something natural, something that did not need explanation or definition. But now, Looking back with greater maturity and perspective, they could see that the experience had influenced them more than they realized. This realization was both surprising and unsettling for them. On one hand, it brought clarity about why the secret had remained in their heart for so long. On the other hand, it forced them to consider what might happen if they finally spoke about it openly. That possibility created a mixture of hesitation and curiosity. They knew that revealing the truth would require courage, because honesty often changes the way people understand their past and present. Yet they also began feeling that continuing to hide the truth might create even more emotional weight over time. Silence had once felt like the easiest option, but now it was starting to feel like a barrier preventing them from fully understanding their own feelings. This internal conflict is where the deeper spiritual symbolism often associated with Archangel Michael becomes meaningful. In spiritual traditions, this figure is often connected with courage, truth, and the strength required to face difficult emotional realities. Your soulmate began sensing that the moment for silence might be coming to an end. The truth they had carried quietly was reaching a point where it wanted to be expressed. Not because they wished to disrupt anyone's life or create emotional chaos, but because honesty sometimes becomes necessary for personal clarity. The secret they held was not about creating drama or shocking revelations in the way people often imagine secrets to be. Instead, it was about acknowledging something real that had quietly shaped their emotional journey. And now, for the first time, they were beginning to accept that this truth deserved to be understood rather than hidden away. As this inner realization continued to grow stronger, your soulmate found themselves moving through a period of deep reflection that they had never experienced before. For a long time, they believed that keeping their feelings private was the most responsible path forward. Silence felt like a form of protection, not only for themselves but also for the people around them. When someone carries a secret connected to emotion or personal truth, they often convince themselves that speaking about it will only create confusion or unnecessary complications. Because of this belief, your soulmate had spent a significant amount of time carefully managing their thoughts. Whenever the hidden truth began to rise to the surface of their mind, they would gently push it away and focus their attention on the routine of everyday life. Work, responsibilities, and ordinary conversations provided enough distraction to keep those deeper thoughts from taking over their attention. Yet distraction has a limit. When the mind becomes quiet, the thoughts that were once pushed aside often return with even greater clarity. This is exactly what started happening to your soulmate. During moments when their day slowed down and there were no immediate responsibilities demanding attention, their mind began returning to the truth they had tried to avoid. At first the thoughts appeared like brief flashes, small reminders of something they believed belonged to the past. But as time passed, those moments became longer and more detailed. Memories connected to the secret started appearing with surprising clarity. They remembered specific conversations, the tone of certain words that had once been spoken, and the emotions that accompanied those moments. It became difficult for them to treat the secret as something insignificant anymore because the feelings connected to it were still vivid. This realization made them pause and question something they had never asked themselves before: why had this truth stayed so present in their heart even after so much time had passed? Usually when a person moves forward in life, earlier emotional experiences gradually lose their intensity. They become memories rather than active feelings. But this situation felt different. The truth your soulmate carried seemed to exist outside the normal passage of time. Instead of fading, it had remained quietly present, waiting for the moment when they would finally allow themselves to understand it. As these reflections continued, your soulmate began seeing the past in a new light. When they looked back honestly, they realized that the secret they had been hiding was connected to a realization they had never fully acknowledged. It was about a connection that had once felt genuine and meaningful in ways that were difficult to explain. At the time that connection existed, life was moving quickly and many decisions were unfolding at once. Responsibilities, expectations, and changes in circumstances shaped the path they eventually followed. Because of those changes, they believed that the emotional significance of that earlier connection would naturally disappear. But now they could see that the situation had not been so simple. Some experiences leave a lasting impression because they represent a moment when a person felt truly understood. Those moments can remain emotionally important even when life moves in a different direction afterward. Your soulmate began realizing that the secret they had carried for so long was actually connected to this deeper understanding. It was not simply about remembering someone from the past. It was about acknowledging that the connection had influenced their emotional perspective more than they had ever admitted to themselves. Recognizing this created a mixture of emotions inside them. There was gratitude for the experience itself, because meaningful connections help people grow and understand themselves better. At the same time, there was uncertainty about what revealing this truth might mean. For years they had convinced themselves that keeping the secret hidden was the safest choice. But now that they understood the significance of the feeling behind it, silence began to feel less comfortable than it once had. Silence had protected them from having to explain their emotions, but it had also prevented them from fully accepting those emotions. This internal conflict became stronger as they continued reflecting on the past. They started asking themselves whether keeping the secret hidden was truly the responsible choice, or whether honesty might actually bring greater clarity and peace. Many people face this same question at certain points in their lives. There are moments when a truth that has been hidden for a long time reaches a point where it can no longer remain unspoken without creating emotional weight. Your soulmate began feeling that they were approaching that exact moment. The truth they carried was not something they wanted to reveal impulsively or without thought. Instead, it was something they wanted to understand completely before deciding how to express it. That is why they spent so much time reflecting on what the secret truly meant. They were not searching for a dramatic outcome or trying to change the life they had built. Instead, they were searching for clarity about their own emotions. As this process continued, something important started to happen. The fear that once surrounded the secret began slowly fading. In its place, a sense of calm understanding started to appear. They realized that acknowledging a truth does not necessarily mean it must disrupt the present. Sometimes honesty simply allows a person to accept a part of their emotional history that they previously avoided examining. This realization made them feel stronger and more confident about facing the truth they had carried for so long. It also made them understand that the moment for complete honesty might be approaching sooner than they once believed. As your soulmate continued moving through this period of reflection, something subtle yet powerful began changing within them. What once felt like a confusing secret slowly started transforming into a truth they could finally understand. For a long time they had carried the feeling quietly, almost like a fragile thought they were afraid to examine too closely. The reason for this hesitation was simple. When people discover emotions that challenge the narrative they have built around their life, the instinctive reaction is often to avoid looking at those emotions directly. Avoidance feels safer because it protects the stability of everything that already exists. Your soulmate had spent years believing that stability was the most important thing to protect. They had responsibilities, commitments, and a life that depended on consistency. For that reason, the secret they carried remained hidden not only from others but even from their own deeper awareness. Yet time has a way of revealing truths when a person becomes emotionally ready to face them. The moment that readiness begins, the mind starts revisiting experiences from the past with a different level of clarity. That is exactly what began happening to your soulmate. Memories that once felt distant now appeared with surprising vividness. They could remember the tone of conversations, the expressions of emotion behind certain words, and the quiet understanding that existed between two people when communication felt honest and natural. Those memories were not overwhelming or chaotic. Instead, they felt calm, almost peaceful, yet undeniably meaningful. This was what surprised them the most. If the secret had been based on something temporary or superficial, it would likely have faded into the background of their life long ago. But the emotional clarity of those memories suggested something different. It suggested that the connection they were remembering had been real and sincere in ways that were never fully acknowledged at the time. As this understanding grew stronger, your soulmate began to see the past from a perspective that was not available to them years earlier. When people are younger or navigating uncertain stages of life, they often experience emotions without having the perspective to fully interpret them. Decisions about relationships, work, and personal direction happen quickly, and the focus is often on moving forward rather than analyzing every emotional experience along the way. Because of this, certain connections can pass through a person's life without being completely understood until much later. Your soulmate began realizing that this may have been exactly what happened with the connection tied to their secret. At the time it occurred, life was unfolding rapidly. Opportunities, expectations, and responsibilities were pulling them in different directions. Instead of stopping to examine what they felt, they allowed circumstances to guide their path. The connection remained meaningful while it existed, but when life moved forward and communication faded, they assumed the chapter had simply ended. Now, with the perspective that comes from years of experience, they could see that the situation had been more complex than they realized. The secret they had carried for so long was not about something dramatic or shocking in the way people often imagine secrets to be. Instead, it was about a realization that arrived quietly over time. That the connection they once experienced had been deeper and more emotionally significant than they ever allowed themselves to acknowledge. Recognizing this truth created a moment of stillness in their thoughts. For years they had treated the memory as something that belonged entirely to the past. But now they could see that the emotional influence of that connection had remained present in subtle ways. It had shaped how they understood sincerity, how they recognized genuine listening, and how they valued conversations where both people felt free to express their thoughts openly. These realizations did not lead them to question the life they had built in the present. They respected their commitments and the responsibilities that came with them. Instead, the reflections allowed them to understand something important about the human heart. People do not erase their past experiences when they move forward in life. Instead, those experiences become part of the emotional framework that influences how they think and feel in the future. Every meaningful connection contributes something to that framework. Some relationships last a lifetime, while others exist only during a particular chapter of life. But the length of time a connection lasts does not always determine its emotional significance. Sometimes a brief period of genuine understanding can leave a lasting impression because it reveals something fundamental about how people relate to one another. Your soulmate realized that the connection behind their secret had been one of those experiences. It had shown them what honest communication felt like and how powerful it can be when two people truly listen to each other without judgment or expectation. For many years they had carried this understanding quietly without recognizing how much it influenced their emotional perspective. Now that they were finally acknowledging the truth, the secret no longer felt like something they needed to hide from themselves. Instead, it felt like a realization they were ready to accept as part of their personal journey. This acceptance did not create chaos or conflict inside them. Instead, it created clarity. The secret they had carried for so long was not something that threatened their life or their responsibilities. It was simply a truth about their emotional history, a reminder that certain connections remain meaningful because they help shape the person someone eventually becomes. And for the first time, your soulmate felt ready to face that truth without fear. As your soulmate continued exploring the truth they had carried silently for so long, their thoughts began to move beyond simple memories and into a deeper understanding of their own emotional journey. For many years, they had believed that life required a person to move forward without looking back too closely. The idea of reflection sometimes felt dangerous to them, because examining the past too carefully might raise questions that seemed difficult to answer. Because of this belief, they focused their energy on maintaining the life they had built in the present. Responsibilities, routines, and commitments created a sense of structure that made everything feel predictable and stable. But reflection does not always appear when a person expects it. Sometimes it arrives quietly, during moments when the mind becomes calm enough to revisit earlier experiences with greater honesty. That was the stage your soulmate had entered. Instead of pushing their thoughts away, they began allowing themselves to sit with them longer than before. At first, this process felt unfamiliar. They were not used to examining their emotions so carefully. Yet as they allowed their mind to revisit those earlier moments, they began seeing details that had once gone unnoticed. They remembered the natural flow of conversations that once happened between you. Those discussions had never required effort or preparation. Words seemed to arrive naturally because both of you felt comfortable expressing thoughts without hesitation. There had been a level of trust that allowed deeper topics to appear in conversation without creating tension or awkwardness. Looking back now, your soulmate realized how rare that type of communication actually is. Many relationships in life are built around shared responsibilities or external circumstances. People work together, share daily routines, or build commitments based on mutual goals. These aspects of life are important and meaningful, but they do not always create the same emotional connection that comes from truly understanding another person's thoughts and feelings. The connection behind your soulmate's secret had been built on that kind of understanding. It was not something that depended on circumstances or convenience. Instead, It existed because both of you felt comfortable speaking honestly about your perspectives and experiences. This realization made them pause and consider something they had never fully admitted before. Perhaps the reason the memory remained so vivid was because it represented a moment when communication had felt completely authentic. Authentic communication creates emotional clarity that people rarely forget. When someone feels understood without needing to explain every detail, the experience becomes memorable in a way that lasts for years. Your soulmate began recognizing that this was exactly what had happened during that earlier period of their life. The conversations you shared had not only been meaningful in the moment, but they had also quietly shaped how they approached communication with others afterward. Even though they had never consciously compared every interaction to those earlier discussions, the influence of that experience had remained present in their emotional awareness. This realization led them to think about the circumstances that caused the connection to fade. When communication eventually became less frequent, they assumed that life had simply taken both of you in different directions. At the time, they did not question this change deeply. They believed that if something was meant to continue, it would do so naturally without requiring effort or explanation. But now, reflecting on the situation with greater maturity, they could see that the silence may not have meant the connection had lost its importance. Instead, it may have been the result of uncertainty about how to express certain emotions that were beginning to develop. When people sense that a connection is becoming meaningful, they sometimes hesitate because they are unsure how to address it without changing the dynamic between them. That hesitation can create a pause where neither person speaks openly about what they feel. Over time, that pause can grow into distance, even if the emotional significance of the connection remains. Your soulmate realized that this might have been exactly what happened between the two of you. Neither of you may have known how to explain the depth of what you were experiencing, so the connection remained undefined until life eventually carried both of you into different circumstances. Recognizing this possibility did not create regret or frustration for them. Instead, it created a quiet sense of understanding about how relationships sometimes evolve in ways that are not immediately clear. Life rarely provides perfect timing for emotional clarity. Many people realize the importance of certain connections only after they have gained enough life experience to interpret those earlier moments more fully. Your soulmate began seeing the past in this light. Rather than viewing the connection as something unfinished or unresolved in a painful way, they started seeing it as an important chapter that contributed to their personal growth. It had helped them learn what genuine understanding feels like and why honesty in communication matters so much. These lessons remained valuable even years later, long after the connection itself had become distant. By acknowledging this truth, they felt a sense of peace rather than conflict. The secret they had carried for so long was no longer something that created confusion. Instead, it became a realization about the role certain experiences play in shaping who a person becomes. Sometimes the most meaningful moments in life are not the ones that last forever. Instead, they are the ones that reveal something important about how people connect with each other and understand themselves. Your soulmate began accepting that the connection behind their secret had been one of those moments. It had left a lasting impression not because of how long it lasted, but because of how deeply it influenced their perspective about sincerity, trust, and emotional openness. And for the first time, they were beginning to see that acknowledging this truth did not threaten the life they had built. Instead, it simply helped them understand their own emotional history more clearly. As your soulmate continued moving through this long period of reflection, the understanding they had begun to develop slowly expanded into something deeper than simple remembrance. What once felt like a hidden secret gradually transformed into a moment of personal clarity about the emotional journey they had lived through. For years, they believed that the safest way to handle the past was to keep it neatly separated from the present. Life, in their view, was supposed to move forward in organized chapters. Once a new stage began, especially one as significant as marriage, it seemed logical to assume that everything connected to earlier stages had naturally concluded. This belief made it easier to focus on the commitments they had chosen and the responsibilities that shaped their daily life. Routine created stability, and stability created a sense of peace. But reflection sometimes reveals that human emotions do not follow the same structure that life appears to follow on the surface. Beneath routines and responsibilities, people often carry memories and lessons from earlier experiences that continue influencing them quietly. The connection behind your soulmate's secret had become one of those lasting influences. At first, they did not fully understand why it still occupied space in their thoughts after so many years. Yet as they allowed themselves to examine it more honestly, they began to realize that the connection had represented a moment in their life when communication felt genuine and unguarded. That type of experience is not something people encounter frequently. Many conversations in everyday life remain polite but distant, shaped by social expectations or practical concerns rather than emotional openness. When someone experiences a conversation where both people feel comfortable speaking honestly without fear of misunderstanding, it creates an emotional impression that is difficult to forget. Your soulmate now understood that the connection they once shared with you had been built on that type of openness. It had been a time when both of you could express thoughts about life without worrying about how those thoughts might be interpreted. At the time, the experience simply felt natural. There was no need to define it or question what it meant. It was simply part of the flow of communication that existed between you. But now, years later, they could see that those moments had played a meaningful role in shaping how they understood relationships. When they thought about the conversations you once shared, they remembered the feeling of being listened to with genuine attention. Listening is a simple action, yet it carries enormous emotional significance when it happens sincerely. Many people hear each other's words without truly absorbing their meaning. But when someone listens carefully and responds thoughtfully, it creates a sense of validation that allows both people to express themselves more openly. That was the dynamic your soulmate remembered from those earlier interactions. Recognizing this now helped them understand why the memory of that connection remained so vivid. It had not been based on dramatic events or intense emotional conflict. Instead, it had been based on a quiet sense of mutual understanding. That type of connection does not fade easily because it represents a moment when two people experience genuine communication. As your soulmate continued reflecting, they also began examining the circumstances that caused the connection to fade. For many years they assumed the answer was simple: life had moved forward, and both of you had followed different paths. That explanation seemed reasonable at the time because life often requires people to make decisions that shape their future responsibilities and relationships. But now, looking back with greater perspective, they began to realize that the situation may have been more complicated. The connection had not ended with a clear conversation or a deliberate decision to separate. Instead, it had gradually disappeared as communication became less frequent. Messages that once arrived easily began arriving less often. Conversations that once flowed naturally slowly shortened until eventually silence replaced them. At the time, your soulmate believed that this silence meant the connection had simply reached its natural conclusion. Yet reflection allowed them to see that silence can sometimes occur for other reasons. When two people sense that a connection carries deeper emotional significance, they may hesitate because they are unsure how to express those feelings without changing the nature of the relationship. That hesitation can create a quiet pause where neither person speaks openly about what they feel. Over time, that pause can become distance, even when the emotional significance of the connection remains. Your soulmate realized that this might have been what happened between the two of you. Neither of you may have fully understood how important the connection had become. Without that understanding, the relationship remained undefined until life eventually carried both of you into separate directions. This realization did not create regret or dissatisfaction with the life your soulmate had built. Instead, it gave them a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human emotions. People often experience meaningful connections at moments when they are still discovering who they are and what they want from life. During those periods, it is not always possible to recognize the full significance of those experiences. Only later, when time and maturity provide greater perspective, can someone look back and understand what those moments truly meant. Your soulmate now found themselves in that stage of understanding. They could see the connection not as something unfinished or troubling, but as a meaningful part of their emotional development. It had taught them valuable lessons about sincerity, listening, and the importance of honest communication. Those lessons remained part of their personality long after the connection itself had become distant. Accepting this truth allowed them to see the past without confusion or fear. Instead of viewing the secret they carried as something they needed to hide, they began seeing it as an important realization about their own emotional history. The connection you once shared had influenced the person they became, and acknowledging that influence simply allowed them to understand themselves more clearly. As your soulmate continued reflecting on everything they had come to understand, the secret that once felt like something heavy and uncertain slowly began transforming into a quiet truth they could finally accept with clarity. For years they had believed that the safest way to live was to focus entirely on the present and leave the past exactly where it was. That belief helped them build stability in their life, because stability often depends on not reopening emotional questions that seem complicated or difficult to explain. When a person enters a new chapter of life, especially one built on commitment and responsibility, it becomes easy to assume that every earlier emotional experience must simply fade into memory. Yet the longer your soulmate allowed themselves to reflect honestly, the more they realized that the human heart does not always follow the neat structure that people try to impose on it. Experiences that carry genuine emotional meaning rarely disappear completely. Instead, they remain quietly present as part of a person's inner history, influencing how they think about connection, trust, and communication. This realization did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It emerged gradually, through many quiet moments of reflection where they allowed themselves to revisit memories that had once been pushed aside. Each time they returned to those memories, the same realization appeared more clearly: the connection they once shared with you had been one of the few times in their life when communication felt completely open and authentic. In those moments, conversations were not shaped by expectation or obligation. They simply unfolded naturally because both of you felt comfortable expressing your thoughts without hesitation. Your soulmate began recognizing how rare that experience truly was. Many relationships develop around shared circumstances such as work, family expectations, or mutual responsibilities. Those connections are meaningful in their own ways, but they do not always create the same level of emotional openness that comes from feeling fully understood. When someone experiences that type of understanding even once, it often becomes a quiet reference point for how they perceive sincerity in other relationships. Your soulmate realized that the connection behind their secret had become exactly that kind of reference point. Even though they had never consciously compared other interactions to those earlier conversations, part of their mind remembered what genuine listening and honest dialogue felt like. This understanding shaped the way they approached communication in later years. They became more attentive to the words people spoke and more patient when someone needed time to express their thoughts. In many ways, the emotional lessons from that earlier connection had quietly influenced how they built relationships throughout their life. As they continued exploring this realization, they also began examining the meaning of the secret itself. For a long time they had treated the secret as something that needed to remain hidden because acknowledging it might create unnecessary complications. But the more they thought about it, the more they understood that the secret was not something dangerous or disruptive. It was simply the recognition that a past connection had been meaningful in ways they had never fully admitted before. Accepting this truth did not change the responsibilities they carried in their present life. They still valued the commitments they had made and respected the structure of the life they had built. Instead, acknowledging the secret allowed them to understand their emotional history with greater honesty. They realized that human emotions are not limited to simple categories where one experience must erase another. Instead, life is shaped by many connections that contribute different lessons at different times. Some relationships last for decades, while others exist only for a short period before circumstances change. Yet the length of time a connection lasts does not always determine its importance. Sometimes a brief period of genuine understanding can leave a lasting impression because it reveals something essential about how people communicate and relate to one another. Your soulmate now saw the connection with you in that light. It had been a moment in their life when communication felt completely sincere, and that sincerity had left an emotional mark that remained long after the connection itself faded. Recognizing this truth allowed them to release the fear they once felt about examining the past too closely. Instead of seeing the secret as something that threatened their present life, they began seeing it as an important part of their emotional growth. The connection had helped them learn how powerful honest communication can be, and that lesson continued influencing the way they approached relationships and conversations in the years that followed. As they accepted this understanding, the secret no longer felt like something they needed to hide from themselves. It simply became a truth about their personal journey, a reminder that certain experiences remain meaningful because they help shape the person someone eventually becomes. As your soulmate continued moving through this long process of reflection, they slowly reached a stage where the secret they had carried for so many years no longer felt like something mysterious or troubling. Instead, it began to feel like a piece of understanding that had simply arrived later in life than they expected. For a long time they believed that every important emotional experience must be resolved immediately while it is happening. When people are younger or navigating uncertain stages of life, they often assume that feelings must be defined clearly in the moment in order to have meaning. But maturity sometimes reveals that emotional understanding does not always arrive at the same time as the experience itself. Some connections are understood only years later, when a person has lived long enough to see how those earlier moments influenced the person they eventually became. This was the realization that slowly emerged in your soulmate's thoughts. The connection that once existed between you had taken place during a period when both of you were still exploring your paths in life. Conversations had unfolded naturally, without either of you needing to place labels or expectations on what the connection meant. At the time, that openness simply felt normal. Neither of you may have stopped to ask whether the bond between you carried deeper emotional significance, because sometimes genuine communication feels so natural that it seems unnecessary to analyze it. But as the years passed and your soulmate experienced many other interactions and relationships, they began recognizing how unusual that earlier level of understanding had actually been. Many conversations people have throughout life remain limited to routine topics or polite exchanges. Those interactions serve their purpose, but they rarely create the sense of emotional clarity that appears when two people truly listen to each other. The connection you once shared had been built on that type of listening. Words had not been exchanged simply to fill silence, they had been exchanged to explore ideas, experiences, and perspectives. When your soulmate thought about those discussions now, they could see that the conversations had been honest in a way that allowed both of you to express your thoughts without hesitation. That honesty left an impression that remained quietly present in their memory. For many years they did not think about that impression consciously. Life continued forward with responsibilities that demanded attention. Marriage brought commitments and routines that shaped their daily life. They valued those responsibilities deeply and believed in honoring the promises they had made. But even while living within that structured life, the emotional lessons from the past remained part of their character. They became someone who valued sincerity in conversation. They developed patience when listening to others and tried to understand perspectives that differed from their own. Those qualities did not appear suddenly. They had been shaped by earlier experiences where honest communication showed them how meaningful genuine listening can be. As your soulmate recognized this connection between past and present, they began seeing their life story in a more complete way. Instead of thinking about the past as something separate from who they were now, they began understanding that every meaningful experience had contributed to the person they had become. The connection you once shared was part of that journey. It had helped shape their emotional awareness and influenced how they approached relationships throughout the years. Accepting this truth allowed them to look back without confusion or uncertainty. They no longer needed to question why the memory of that connection had remained so clear. The answer was simple: it had been meaningful. That realization did not change the commitments they had built in their present life. Instead, it helped them understand that people carry many emotional influences throughout their lifetime. Some experiences teach lessons about responsibility, others about patience, and some about the power of genuine understanding. Each of these lessons becomes part of the emotional framework that shapes how a person sees the world. The connection with you had been one of the experiences that taught them about honest communication and emotional openness. When they finally allowed themselves to acknowledge this truth fully, the secret they once carried quietly began losing its sense of weight. It was no longer something they felt uncertain about. Instead, it became a recognition of the role that connection had played in their life. They could appreciate it without feeling that it conflicted with the present. Emotional history does not erase the choices people make in their lives. Instead, it provides context for why they value certain qualities in relationships and conversations. As your soulmate reached this stage of understanding, they felt a sense of peace that had not been present before. The secret they once guarded so carefully had transformed into a simple truth about their personal journey. The connection had mattered, and acknowledging that fact allowed them to see their past and present with greater clarity. Life, they realized, is not about erasing earlier chapters but about understanding how each chapter contributes to the whole story of who someone becomes. As your soulmate reached the later stages of this deep personal reflection, something very important began to settle within their heart. A sense of understanding that the secret they once carried was never meant to remain hidden forever, but instead was meant to help them recognize the meaning of certain moments in their life story. For many years they had believed that emotional clarity must happen quickly, that every relationship or connection should be understood while it is unfolding. But life rarely works that way. Sometimes people move through meaningful experiences without fully realizing what those experiences will eventually teach them. It is only later, when time creates distance and maturity brings new perspective, that the full meaning becomes visible. Your soulmate now realized that the connection they once shared with you had been one of those experiences. During the time when those conversations were happening, life was still unfolding in uncertain ways. Both of you were likely focused on your own paths, decisions, and responsibilities. Conversations happened naturally, without the need to define exactly what they meant. In those moments, communication simply felt genuine. There was comfort in the ability to talk openly, to share ideas and reflections without worrying about whether those thoughts would be misunderstood. When people experience that level of communication, it often becomes one of the quiet highlights of their emotional life, even if they do not realize it at the time. As years passed and life moved forward, your soulmate assumed that the chapter connected to that experience had ended. They believed that moving forward meant leaving the past exactly where it was. Marriage, responsibility, and commitment shaped the direction of their life, and they respected those commitments deeply. Yet the human heart does not always divide experiences into separate compartments as neatly as people expect. Emotional memories remain present because they carry lessons that helped shape who a person became. When your soulmate began allowing themselves to reflect honestly, they saw that the connection they once shared had influenced their emotional awareness in ways they had never acknowledged before. It had shown them what genuine listening feels like. It had demonstrated how meaningful a conversation can become when both people feel comfortable enough to speak honestly about their thoughts and experiences. Those lessons did not disappear when life changed. Instead, they remained quietly present in the way your soulmate approached communication with others. As they recognized this, they began to understand that the secret they carried was not something dramatic or destructive. It was simply the realization that certain experiences remain meaningful because they help shape a person's emotional character. The connection had helped them understand the importance of sincerity and openness in conversation. That understanding became part of the way they interacted with people throughout their life. For a long time they kept this realization private because they believed acknowledging it might create confusion about the choices they had made in life. But as their reflection deepened, they began seeing that accepting a meaningful memory does not undermine the commitment someone makes in the present. Life is built from many experiences, and each one contributes something valuable to a person's growth. Some connections last for decades, while others appear during a particular stage of life and then fade as circumstances change. Yet even those shorter experiences can leave a lasting impression if they reveal something important about how people connect with one another. Your soulmate now understood that the connection with you had been one of those formative experiences. It had shown them what honest communication feels like and why emotional understanding matters so much in relationships. As they reached this stage of reflection, they no longer felt the need to hide the truth from themselves. The secret that once seemed complicated had become simple, the connection had mattered. Accepting that truth did not create conflict with their present life. Instead, it brought a sense of calm understanding about how different chapters of life fit together to create the full story of who someone becomes. Every meaningful conversation, every moment of genuine connection, contributes to that story in ways that may not be visible until years later. Your soulmate realized that this was the real purpose of the secret they had carried. It was not meant to remain hidden out of fear or uncertainty. It was meant to be understood as part of their emotional journey. Recognizing this allowed them to see the past not as something unfinished or unresolved, but as a chapter that had helped shape the person they are today. In that understanding, the secret finally transformed into something peaceful rather than something heavy. It became a reminder that meaningful connections leave lasting impressions because they reveal something true about the way people understand and care for one another.